You don't know how sweet I am. You don't know how sweet I am. I am what I am, and I am sweet. You don't know how sweet I am.
Yo, check this. Yo, I might not be what you want me to be. You might not see what you want to see. But if you got a minute, listen to what I gotta say. Because it's a brand new year and it's a brand new day. See, there's a gap between my culture and the life that I lead. So some will call me an apple, and some a bad seed. They have no idea how my heart will bleed. Their words and attitudes are things I just don't need.
You don't know how sweet I am. I am what I am, and I am sweet.
You see, I'm proud of who I am, and I'm proud of where I'm from. Those ones spreading racism, they're just fucking dumb. Now if you're looking at my life, and you say I've assimilated, to simplify things, just a little more complicated. See, I'm a modern day native, with a modern day life. I have modern day problems, and modern day strife. Now I hear other natives, they talk about the past, and will I do the same? Fuck that. See, I've got no time to dwell on what's already done. I've got too many things that I want to do. And they don't include knives, and they don't include guns. I'm talking about knowledge and sharing it too. See, my people need to learn how to cohabitate, get rid of the anger, and get rid of the hate. We gotta stop for a minute and learn to educate. And you'll see in the end, we all have to communicate. I know there'll be a time to make a stand and a time to fight, but if you do that, make sure the cause is right. Because if the cause is right and the cause is just, greater numbers of people will be backing you up. History has repeatedly shown to us all that united we stand and divided we fall. They were talking about natives and natives alone, because this is a big world and this world is our home. Now I've seen some beautiful people and ugly ones too, and there's no single color that comes into view. So the message I'm sending, it's not all that long. It's just, I want the human race to be stronger than strong. I said I just want the human race to be stronger than strong.
You all have to be strong.
Done it. Word.
We all have to be strong. Peace.
Sugali swagwag, Galahindi Neo Gets, Wagi Sli Wagi, Ni Wakidoloda, Onida Ngwahiwanege, Ani, Bojo, Danse, Okinapi. How, for those of you who are new, first of all, what I've done is I've just introduced myself in my original language, which I do at the beginning of each of my streams. So, what I said is, hello everyone, Galahindi is my name. I'm a member of the people of the Standing Stone First Nations of the Thames here on Turtle Island, the northern part of Turtle Island. It's been relabeled Canada, and I am a member of the Bear Clan. I hope that you can hear me. Move this here, stuff here. Okay. Okay, looks like my mic levels are moving, so you should be able to hear me. Anyway, so I said, hello, my name is Galahini. That translates to clouds passing over in the colonial language. And I'm situated on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Delaware, Huron, and Anishinaabe nations in a small part of area that we now call southwestern Ontario. in the northern part of Turtle Island. Now, many of you may have gotten a message from me at some point, somewhere along the lines, or saw a post of what I'm doing tonight. Tonight, as I'd mentioned, we have a special guest coming on stream tonight. Her name is Cambria Harris. And Cambria is about to talk about her personal experience and history with the Two Spirits and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls epidemic here on Turtle Island. She'll talk about what's being done now and what we all hope to accomplish by the end of everything once it's said and done. So at the end of her talk, we'll have a Q&A. So what I will ask is that people save their questions till the end of her talk when she comes on, and so that we don't detract her from her message. Now, just to be clear, the 2 plus MMIWG doesn't just affect our women. Um, there is an epidemic that affects our men and boys as well, uh, but their experiences are very rarely covered in the mainstream media. Um, and that, of course, is another whole stream with a different guest that we'll set up for a later date. But in the meantime, while we set up um, and get ready for Cambria, and she's just setting things up on her end as well, I wanted to show a couple short clips to kind of fill in the general background of what's gotten us to where we are today. So there's a very big systemic problem on Turtle Island, and that's the history of residential schools. Is what we call it in the northern part of Turtle Island. In the southern part of Turtle Island, they call them boarding schools. And as they're something like 150 plus years now, that these we've been institutionalizing Indigenous children for a strategy to remove cultural identity, language, community. Oh, I just heard a beep. My homie, you don't go for the raid. Welcome in, my friend. I appreciate you being here, and welcome in, Raiders. You're kind of catching us as we're getting things started, so I appreciate you coming in and joining us. I just finished introducing myself. Anyone who was already in chat, um, take a look at my homie here. There's a link to his channel. So just to, I don't know, so I'm just going to pop over here for a second. So it's my homie Tutero, um, Canadian news and politics, lofty enthusiast gamer, streaming sporadically until make a full recovery. So the recovery I'm hoping is not COVID that you're having to deal with, but um, that is hopefully you're feeling much better. So what I was just explaining to the chat and Rose Armories, or is it Roz Armories? Yanko for being here. I appreciate you coming here. Oh, beat cancer. That's a tough one. And I know that it can go into remission for a while, and hopefully it stays there. Ruskler, uh, welcome in, Yanko. Thank you for popping in. So as I was saying, the uh, the issue that we have right now with the background behind where we are with the missing and murdered Indigenous people really is that it's got a long history that's embedded in Canadian, what we call Canadian history, right? So that starts with the residential school systems. So which has become a systemic issue since the beginning of colonization, right? So the whole point was to institutionalize the indigenous children as a strategy to remove the cultural identity, our language, our community connections, with the goal to assimilate indigenous people into a more colonial society. So why? Well, like most colonizers in various parts of the world, it's all about the control of the land and its resources. And so to eliminate obstacles like the indigenous inhabitants, oh, hold on a sec, I'm just going to um, admit Cambria into the stream. Sigoli Cambria, whoops, Sigoli Cambria, can you hear me?
Hi, yes.
Okay, so I just finished introducing myself. I was just kind of going over a little bit here with the community. So as I was saying, the reason is for why we have this is that colonizers all over the world are trying to take control of the land and its resources. And it's all about that, right? So to eliminate the obstacles like indigenous inhabitants of a land opens that control. So here on Turtle Island, it's almost worked. I mean, many of our languages are on the brink of this extinction. Our
Mhm.
elder population is diminishing, along with the knowledge of the ceremony and traditions and the languages that they all have. So the repercussions of this attempt, again, to assimilate or eliminate indigenous peoples here is the intergenerational trauma that's been left on a large part of our populations. So the lack
Okay.
of equal education, the lack of equal opportunities, or even equal treatment for so many years has damaged Indigenous peoples' self-esteem, our expectations that were set through broken treaties, and the systemic racism that still exists today. And you'll see in many Indigenous cultures, the backbone of what keeps us organized, strong, and going forward and being successful in maintaining our culture is to break up that culture by two target populations, the women and the youth. So this was done in two ways. So the children were institutionalized in these loosely called and inaccurately called schools. And secondly, the colonial laws that allow our women to be victimized by abuses and even murder, and with the perpetrator essentially getting off scot free in most cases. These laws are made in a way that allows our women to be targeted. And being targeted, people are doing this and getting away with it without having any consequences. And for the women that aren't gone missing or aren't murdered, they're being incarcerated. We have indigenous women in incarcerations that are 50% to 55% of women in prisons in Canada are indigenous. That that's crazy when you consider they make up like 4% of our population. So how do those numbers actually, you know, meet up? So you can see how um, uneven and unequal this has been. And
Mhm.
so Canada for many years has enjoyed the reputation of being a multicultural, friendly, welcoming country. The current administration here, albeit better than the opposition, is still coming up short. And this is where the following um, talk that we're going to have is going to kind of bring some light and shed some light on what is happening. And so I'm going to actually, since Cambria is here, I'm going to wait for those clips that I was going to show you until later on. Again, I'm going to ask if questions come up along the way during her talk, that you hold those questions to the end. You can post them in chat. You can um, you can whisper them to me, whatever works for you, or just wait till the end and then post them then. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat for questions and make note of them as they come up. But if you could just hold off on the questions until we get to the end of the talk, okay? So I'm going to switch over here because I got my camera switching over here. If I can turn on this. Here we are. So thank you, Cambria, so much for taking the time and joining us today. And I hope that we can bring some awareness. By the way, chat, just so you know, I will post this link periodically in here just so that you have the contact for if any of you have the ability to make donations or contribute in any way. Uh, there are daily needs that are at Camp Morgan. Those could be firewood, could be medicines, could be food, just could be propane, so that the people there can stay warm. Um, I think it's Command uh, Camp Morgan. So there's a link there as well that you can get to their Facebook group too. And you will have to be allowed into it. So you have to say, ask to join, and one of the administrators will uh, decide whether or not to allow you into the group. So just so you're ahead, just to keep trolls out, right? Because we don't want people bringing negativity to the circle. So I'm going to um, change my screen so that this shows the speaker. And I will let you introduce yourself in the way that you feel is appropriate, Cambria, and I'll let you do your talking.
Okay. Um, Hello, my name is Cambria Harris. I'm 21 years old. My spirit name is West Flying Sparrow Woman. I am a member of Long Plain First Nation, and I am the eldest daughter of Morgan Harris, who is believed to be in either the Prairie Green or the Birdie landfill right now. Is there anything you wanted to ask me specifically?
Well, I guess I think what most of the people are not aware of is um, what is the missing and murdered Indigenous women? How bad is it really? Um, as most Indigenous people, I mean, we've grown up with it. So to us, it's an everyday life thing. But for non-Indigenous people or for the mass population who have had no exposure to it, this may be a new term for them. So is there maybe perhaps a way of just kind of giving them a little bit of history, how we came up with that term, or why we have that term now, and what it means to the general population?
So, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two spirits has been going on since, well, the 70s. And before that, we've heard of the Highway of Tears. And if you look it up on Google, it says that the case of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two spirits is in the thousands. And that is only the documented case, given that these databases aren't always updating when these women are found deceased and such. And it happens everywhere. It's an epidemic across Turtle Island. You go to BC, you go to Alberta, you go to Saskatchewan, you go to Manitoba, anywhere you go, there is cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And like he said, it's and non-Indigenous people, they don't really see it because it doesn't affect them personally. Whereas Indigenous people, it affects an entire community when we lose one of our women. And in this case, we lost four. And so quite frankly, it's a genocide and it's wrong. And we see it happen over and over again. The government just wipes it up, and we see the millions of billboards throughout the city year after year, and nobody blinks an eye, and nobody even hesitates to look or find out who these women were. They're more so looking at them as a story, and these women were not stories. They live lives full of love, and they were so much more than that, than just four women who were murdered by a white supremacist serial killer. And this isn't the only case. So yeah, it's really, really unfortunate.
So you've been doing interviews now pretty well nonstop for a long time now, like a couple months almost, maybe. And so when you see the stories or the end result that the media actually put out there, I understand a lot of that is really kind of condensed in and maybe a little bit sugar coated so that it's palatable for the population. I guess this is kind of where I think, as we mentioned this before, is I think that we got to stop sugarcoating it so much and
Yeah.
maybe just putting it out there as raw information and let the adults be adults and decide for themselves, how much this affects them or whether or not they have something that to help change this concept, right? Because that's one of the biggest questions I get all the time is from non-indigenous people is what is it that we can do to help? Um, so what is Camp Morgan need as far as help wise? What can we do to help push along their cause? Because ultimately, I think what they want is the search to actually start, right?
Yeah.
Because we have these indigenous women who are in these two um, landfills that are not being looked for. It's we don't want to wait 150 years like we did with the children from the residential schools before we start searching.
Mhm.
Because that goes on, right? So how can people help push that awareness and cause through?
Um, well, like you said, the media has been really, really sugarcoating it, and to help us, you start talking to people, you start talking to your colleagues, and you start having those uncomfortable conversations and speaking on what's going on. Because, as uncomfortable as it makes you, could you imagine how it feels for the indigenous community who feels this and sees this on a daily basis? And it makes me mad that the media has been blocking out so much because it's such a long story. So this all started back in May when my mother went missing. So May 1st, my mother was reported missing. We did a walk with Bear Clan and such. Come June, that's when the police learned that there are remains believed to be in the Prairie Green landfill. They did not disclose that to the public. And then come September, they didn't grab. That's when they grabbed my blood sample for DNA. And a blood sample typically takes 1 to 2 months, so it went into a missing persons national database on behalf of my mother. And December 1st was when my mother was identified as a victim of a homicide. So if you look at that timeline, just that one small timeline, that's 3 to 5 months too late. When essentially, if they knew the remains were in there since June, they should have taken my sample in June. They decided to have their own secret feasibility study and make the decision that they were not going to search because apparently human life isn't feasible. And they swept that under the rug. And the media continues to keep sweeping that under the rug. And I think that's pretty freaking disgusting. So December 1st comes, and the next thing you know, I'm speaking out at a vigil for my mom outside at the murderer's house. And I got noticed by Indigenous organizations who pulled a bunch of money together to send me to Ottawa. And I guess a little birdie told the Winnipeg Police Service that I was going to Ottawa and I was going to Parliament. And that's when they met me there, just before my plane. And they sat me and my family down. And they said that I was to correct the misinformation going around the public and that these women were believed to be in the Prairie Green landfill and not the Brady. And that they didn't want someone protesting at the wrong landfill. So, looking back at it, had I have not gone to Parliament or even had the opportunity to go to Parliament, they would have not have told me that information that they were believed to be in the Prairie Green. And so that's why I don't believe them, because they couldn't even give me a reasoning as to why they believe that. And that's when I asked them, how long have you known the remains to be there? Since June. And then that's when they sat me down and they had the nerve to present a PowerPoint presentation of all the reasons why they won't search the Prairie Green. And apparently it's because it's too big and it's too much work compared to the Brady landfill. But They were able to freaking search Picton's farm. They were able to look through all those pigs for all those other women. So why the hell can't they search a damn landfill? It makes absolutely no sense to me. And I asked him, I said, so what does this mean? Like, what are you going to do to ensure that 4 to 5 years from now, you're not sitting down with another Indigenous family telling them that you won't search for their missing loved one? And they didn't have a single damn answer. And so when they told me they weren't going to search, I said, I'm not going to take that. And you better mark my words. I'm going to Ottawa and you're not going to like what I have to say. And I walked away, and I don't think I've ever seen so much damn fear on the Winnipeg Police Service's face. And so to Ottawa I went and called out the government.
Manitoba, is it the most? Does it have the highest Indigenous population in Canada? It's got to be one of them, right? Between
It's one of them. It's one of them for sure. I know we do have a high Indigenous population because Winnipeg's the epicenter of where missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls happens. A lot of our women go missing here. Every single day there's a new poster, and it's really, really sad.
yeah, I think Manitoba and British Columbia, because I think the
Yeah,
Trail of Tears is in British Columbia, right? So I understand your mother may have had some demons of her own and some struggles along the way.
yeah.
How much do you think that that may have had um, an effect on their decision to kind of just brush this aside?
Um, I think that's what a big part of it is because all four of these women were vulnerable Indigenous women who were known to be homeless and hang around and use shelters because that's their only way of surviving that they had. And I feel like a large portion of the timeline and the reason why they were so ignorant and negligent is because they didn't, quite frankly, they didn't look at these vulnerable Indigenous women as human beings, and it shows. Because they couldn't even take my sample until September when I would have gladly given it the day my mom went missing. I went out searching for my mother before they did, and I don't even think they ever freaking did. And then for vulnerable Indigenous women to be targeted by a well-known white supremacist with far-right extremist views and everything beyond that, who quite literally thought he was some kind of high god, just angers me. It really, really, really angers me because all of the red flags were there. The police knew of this person. I'll see if I can find it. I will pull up the Skibiki timeline, and I can tell you exactly how long they've failed these women, and it's just messed up. It's really messed up. After that, I'll go into who my mother was. But
Now he's been in incarceration since like last
Rebecca,
June,
since yeah,
since
since Rebecca.
and that trial hasn't even started yet.
No, it's
So
continued for
what
5
is
months.
what's the justification behind not starting the trial at least for the one that they're aware of? I mean, if they've got enough evidence, right,
Mm-hmm.
for them to start the trial on his her charge against Rebecca Contois.
Yeah.
Why are we still waiting now? It's almost a year later.
Because it's really, really complicated because they had found Rebecca Contois first, and originally they had no reason to believe that there were other victims. And then 6 months later, they find out that there are 3 more. So that makes it even more complex. And then they got to decide if they want to do them all as separate cases. And then if you do it as separate cases, that gives a chance for each individual woman's case to get thrown out, right? And so, or you can do them all together, and it can take up to 30 months because there's just, things
So,
are always changing.
so my problem with that is that if they do it as one case against all four women, and for some reason there's a shadow of a doubt from one of them, Does
Yeah.
that then mean he gets off on all of the cases, or versus doing them individually and him being able to be convicted and charged at least on individual cases that we can actually prove, and him not getting away from all of them?
Yeah. Well, I have a feeling they know a lot more than what the public knows, and even what I know, because I'm not allowed to know even a lot of that kind of investigative process, because it's detrimental. It can throw out the entire case, and it will all come out in trial. But I have a really good feeling that they have proof that he did it, and the proof is coming out through the public. There was I think it was a CBC article when this all first started happening. There was a man who frequented the shelter, the Dinaway map, where these four women were known to frequent, as well as the monster. And he came out and said that he saw this man day after day, just talking and preying on Indigenous women and bringing them home. And he had a home, but he took advantage of the resources that were there to take advantage of them. Um, Here, I pulled up the timeline. So this is what makes me mad, because they've known about him since June 15th, 2015. So I'll try not to say his last name because he doesn't even deserve that recognition. He assaults his common law partner. According to a statement of facts later agreed to by Crown and defense attorneys, he grabbed his pregnant partner's hair and punched her in the face several times, then tried to strangle her. He also told her he would kill her if she called police. 1 month later, he is convicted of assaulting his common law partner. After spending 2 months behind bars, he's sentenced to 2 years probation. And then just 3 months after that, in December 21st, 2015, a different woman who is his common law partner files for a protection order against him, saying in her application she feared, quote, "He won't stop until I'm dead," quote. 3 years later, the monster marries the woman who is now his estranged wife. She later says in a protection order hearing that she was under the influence on their wedding day and went to detox from meth 4 days later. So that shows, again, he preys on vulnerable women who are clearly not in the right frame of mind to be staying with him or leaving with him. September 4th, 2019, a year after they got married, him and his estranged wife is granted a protection order against him for 3 years. She alleged in both an application for the order and a hearing that she suffered a litany of abuse at his hands and that he threatened to kill her. 2021, January. His estranged wife alleges her husband assaulted her. The woman's mother says it involved an incident in which her daughter was chased down an apartment hallway with a knife. The incident left the woman with injuries from being punched in the head and hit over the head with a cane, according to her mother. He's later charged with a weapon and assault causing bodily harm, but those charges ended up being stayed. October 2021, a friend of his who spent time with the accused at the apartment that he lived in from until the time of his arrest in May 2022 said he went to Winnipeg shelters for meals. The friend said he took the bus daily to the Dinaway Mac for breakfast, lunch, and often went to Siloam Mission for dinner. So what is he, scoping out his prey? That's pretty much what it sounds like. During Skibicki's time in the apartment, the friend said he saw about half a dozen women he believes were Indigenous come and go. Though Monster told him he had at least 30 women stay with him for varying periods of time. December 14, 2021. A judge acquits him in a trial connected with an alleged violation of an order that banned him from contacting his estranged wife. But the judge said he found her testimony unreliable due to her memory issues, and the woman's mother says her daughter was diagnosed with post-concussion syndrome after an earlier alleged attack involving Skibicki that had an effect on her memory. So they threw that case out because he had beaten her so bad that she couldn't remember or recollect the events properly. And I think that should have been enough evidence to freaking charge him. And it just keeps going. It just keeps going. And then that's when, March, when the Buffalo woman was killed. May 1st was when he killed my mother. May 4th was when he killed Mercedes Meyer. And May 14th, 15th was when he killed Contois. And it just goes to show you that they knew. They absolutely knew. And you can't tell me that the red flags weren't there. and it's just so wrong. And
So was 2016, you said, when they first knew about him?
2015. Well, that's 7 years.
2015.
Yeah. So yeah, June 15, 2015, and this was on cbcnews.ca. They have a timeline of everything that they're keeping track of, and so he murdered 4 women, and now I'm at Camp Morgan protesting at the Brady landfill.
So he murdered 4 women that we're aware of.
Yes, that we are aware of, and apparently they have no reason to believe that there's any more. But I don't believe that. Why should we believe that when there's how many cases in Winnipeg and just any woman missing from the northern communities just outside of Winnipeg or any reserve surrounding us? And
Well,
there's
yeah,
women that
and
are
even
rejected.
since then, there was another Indigenous woman who was found in her home. 20, I think she was 27, who was found in the garage of her home that she shares with her grandparents.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
and the police are saying that they have no reason to believe that there's any foul play, but they won't give any details.
yeah,
Um, and so I think this whole curtain of secrecy kind of makes me that much more weary about believing much of what they say, or especially if they failed in any way on their end to properly investigate or search for someone when families are first telling them. This whole it's got to wait 48 hours. I mean, it is ridiculous, or 24 hours. I'm not sure what the
yeah. It's
timeline
48 hours
is.
before they can actually file a missing persons report.
Right. Which seems to be ridiculous. And so and what I was saying earlier about this whole systemic issues is even the things that are put out there that are meant to help. For example, the Amber Alert issue. I mean, this is kind of off topic, but there was like a 5-year-old child who went missing from the front of his home. Um, And when the parents went and reported him missing, they said they couldn't do a search because he wasn't missing long enough. And then when that time went by and he was still missing, they couldn't do an Amber Alert because there was no evidence that he was in danger. A 5-year-old child goes missing from the front of his home. How is he not in danger?
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
so that's another systemic part of this whole colonial system we have
Yeah,
to deal with. Um, and then the woman in Quebec who filmed herself, her last minutes in a hospital, um, of nurses mocking and making fun of her and making racial jokes about her, um, and ended up dying on the hospital bed because they didn't help her when they could have. There's so much they could have done just simply by giving her oxygen to help her live. And they refused to do that small thing, and which resulted her lying there in bed in pain for hours and then dying. And that footage being put out on Facebook because she was, smart enough to at least, or it had it together enough to at least film herself and hearing the nurses in the background talk the way that they did.
yeah,
So we definitely have a systemic issue in Canada, and for the premier of Quebec to come out and say there's no systemic racism in his province is a little bit of a joke, because
yeah,
we know that it's not in just one. It's across the entire nation. Um,
absolutely.
and we have the policeman who went and shot and killed Chantal Moore in New Brunswick, who was there to do a wellness check. How does a person who gets a wellness check end up dead? It
Yeah,
doesn't. It's just
yeah, absolutely.
so much of this that's going on, um, and a lot of it again is against Indigenous women. That seems to be primarily what we're getting in the media. I mean, I know that there's an issue with men and boys too, but it doesn't get nearly it doesn't get the same coverage, even on that level. And I think that might in itself be a sign of who is doing the news and censoring what gets put out there, because men don't want to be seen as weak. And
No,
so we dare not present an issue where, men are victims, because we're not victims, right? Um, in this day and age, this is still the mentality, I think, um, that's been
absolutely.
going on. Yeah. So uh, I want to say thank you to Mayor McCheese for joining us tonight, Yanko, for the raid. I appreciate you bringing your community over. Thank you, and welcome, new raiders. For those of you who've just gotten here, we're talking with Cambria Harris. Cambria's mother, Morgan, um, is one of four women suspected to be killed by the same serial killer in Winnipeg, and their remains are in one of two landfills, along with other Indigenous women, we're sure, um, that are not being searched for. That the law has decided that they don't feel it's feasible for them to be able to actually do a search of these landfills. And so family and friends have set up Camp Morgan at the entrance of one of these landfills to prevent people from continually going in and dumping more garbage on the indigenous women that are there. And so speaking of that, from what I understand, they've actually reopened part of it. Is that right?
Yeah, I can explain that a little more. So we've had Camp Morgan set up at the Brady landfill. So initially we were doing blockades. We did blockades. One day we take a break, do the blockade another day to make a stand. And December 18th, we permanently set up Camp Morgan, and it's been set up ever since. And like you said, it's to ensure that no more garbage is thrown on top of our women. And we're protesting at the Brady landfill specifically because they're already working on the Prairie Green landfill feasibility study. But I want the Brady landfill searched as well for any and all missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And I stand with the calls of the families. I stand with the victims that are believed to be in there, such as Tanny Nepanak, who's been in there since 2012, and they searched for 6 days and said goodbye. That was it. And then they offered to put a memoriam there, like as if that was going to make it any better. And the landfill's not a sacred resting place. And so that's been her resting place for a decade now. And it's not just about my mother, Morgan, anymore. It's about the three other women lost to this tragedy as well, and our unidentified sister, Buffalo woman, Mashkade Bishake Ikwe. And so right now there is a feasibility study being done on the Prairie Green landfill, and they have to do the study first before they can even request funding from the federal, provincial, municipal governments, because they'll all play a different part in it. And one of my family members is on the feasibility study committee, and it's an Indigenous run committee because, well, the Winnipeg police said that they weren't going to search and that they were not going to do anything. And I ended up having to go to Parliament and calling the government out basically to tell them to do their damn job and end the genocide and colonialism and systemic racism that they have against Indigenous peoples. And it makes me mad because, and I hate saying this, I absolutely hate saying this, but we all know that if I was a brown skinned Indigenous girl, they would not be listening. But because the fact that I look white, that's the only reason why. And even then, I'm getting censored. And that freaking makes me mad. It shouldn't matter what color my skin is. And it comes from all sides. Growing up all my life, I was told I was not Indigenous, but then I was told I look too funny to be white either. So I never know which way I fit in. And it comes from everyone and anywhere. And I'm seeing a lot of it happening at Camp Morgan, the damn Freedom Convoy truckers coming over and trying to say that they're in support when we know that they're responsible for the Highway of Tears. We know that they're responsible for their propagandic agenda that further devalues and dehumanizes the lives of Indigenous people, Indigenous communities, and people of color. And that's exactly what the government wants to happen when these kind of events take place, when our women go missing and murdered, when they're found in the most gruesome of ways. They let these supremacists get away with it because they know that it distracts from the bigger picture. While we're too busy focusing on these far right views and the people talking smack, The government's sitting back and laughing because they're watching the lateral violence happen between us. The direct links to colonialism that they implemented over the hundreds of years, we're using it against each other instead of the actual perpetrator who started it hundreds of years ago. So yeah.
So someone's asked here, um, can anyone go to the landfills and do ground penetrating radar there? Like, are there restrictions to people actually going out there and doing searches themselves?
Yeah, so there's a lot of legal things that have to go into it. So if we were to just go into the Brady landfill, we absolutely would get arrested. And quite frankly, we don't want that. We don't want our warriors getting arrested. We need Camp Morgan to stay up as long as possible because Camp Morgan is a sacrifice to my mother, who was homeless, as well as these other women. They're sacrificing themselves in order to ensure that our women come home. And the thing that a lot of people don't seem to be understanding is the reason why they were able to search the Brady landfill is because it's above ground and it's loose debris. Whereas Prairie Green is compact, they put clay over it, they run construction vehicles, so it compacts it, it spreads things apart, and so it's harder. And so I don't know if it's Sonorite or that's the one that picks up all the little fragments. Yeah, they wouldn't be able to use that on the Prairie Green because it's so disleveled. You wouldn't pick up anything. You wouldn't know what you're looking at. Whereas they can use that on the Brady landfill. The Brady landfill, they're able to search no problem. And so the spot in the Brady landfill where Rebecca Contois was found and where I believe my mother is shut down, and that would be cell 32 or cell 33, one of those. And that's been shut off. That has absolutely been shut off. There's no more dumping on it. It's closed off, and they've started a new cell that they're going to continue dumping on. And it's the same for Prairie Green. That cell that they believe that my mother is in and the other woman, it's shut down, and they're diverting the trash to other areas. And so Brady Green, we know that because we have physically been brought up by, I think it was the city who sent a bus for us that met us there, and they brought us into the Brady landfill where the spot was so that we could make sure that no garbage was further being dumped, and so that we could hold a ceremony and put a spirit plate down. And that's actually what we're planning to do on Sunday, is go over to Prairie Green and do the exact same thing as well to see the physical site.
Okay, so I just got some people jumping into the chat here. So the Surfs TV, Yonko for the raid. I appreciate you bringing your community over. Thank you so much. For those of you who just arrived, um, I usually say also Sugoli Swagwag, Galihindi Neogets, Wagi Sliwagi, Niwakadoloda, Onida, Gungwe Ani Bojo, Dante. So I said, hello everyone. Galahindi is my name. Translates to clouds passing over in the colonial language. I'm a member of the people of the Standing Stone First Nations, which is just in the area that we now call southwestern Ontario, on the northern part of Turtle Island. And I say Yanko, or thank you, Yuko Donla's friends for coming in and joining the talk. So we're talking with Cambria Harris, who is the daughter of Morgan Harris, one of four women believed to be killed by a serial killer in Winnipeg. And she's just kind of giving us a bit of overview of what's been going on, what we're dealing with the missing and murdered Indigenous women and two-spirited people here in on the, again, what we call Canada, and the systemic racism that's affecting how little action there is being taken to address this and to help find ways of protecting the indigenous women as we should in this country and the resources that we have and the lack of using them for the indigenous people. The media, of course, will cover huge stories if there are, if you're a blue-eyed, blonde young woman who's, comes from a well-to-do family, you're going to be all over the news, and you're going to be international news. I can't remember the last girl that was in the States who had specials done in Australia, New Zealand, and news coverage in England. Where are these stories in news coverage when it comes to the indigenous people? And why are we not jumping on getting that awareness out? And that's what we're trying to do today, is just kind of talk about a bit about that. And so sorry to interrupt you, Cambria, if you want to.
So, yeah, we have a camp set up that's been set up since December 18th in protest, and as to what is going on at the Brady and the Prairie Green landfill, and just any landfill across Canada, because with the epidemic of and the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two spirits, and our women are going missing, then where are they? And why aren't we finding them? And why aren't they searching? And quite frankly, my mind immediately goes to a landfill or a highway. And I think that because we've seen the negligence in this specific case regarding these four women, and the fact that there's still two women lying in either the Prairie or the Brady, and that they don't know where one of them are, which is Buffalo woman Mashkede Bijake Ikwe, just shows the systemic racism and depression that they have against Indigenous women, specifically vulnerable Indigenous women, because they are treated as less than. The government only listens to you if you're a successful Indigenous businessman, and even then, you're treated lesser than your colleagues. So, is there anything you wanted to ask?
So one of the chat members is asking, is it possible that trained dogs can work to smell for or find human remains?
They can, but there is a reasoning as to why they didn't, and I believe they explained that in the PowerPoint presentation that the Winnipeg police released around December 8th. And there was a reason why dogs were not able to be used, as well as why there wasn't able to be sonar radar used in the Prairie Green versus the Brady landfill. But actually, it just came to my attention today that we're working with the anthropologist who worked on the Pigton farm. And so I'm really hoping that something good comes out of that, and that we're able to successfully recover the remains of these women and any and all missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls that might be lying in the landfills.
Uh,
Because, yeah.
now there may be people in the chat who don't know what the Picton Farms are. Can you kind of enlighten them?
Here,
Because
I'll look up the legitimate facts so I don't get the number wrong, because I don't want to disrespect the family like that. So, how many? So Robert Picton was a notorious serial killer who was also a former pig farmer, and he's suspected of being one of the most prolific serial killers in Canadian history because he would butcher his victims and essentially feed them to the pigs to get rid of the evidence. And I'm trying to find the size of the farm, but you can see the photos. You probably won't be able to see on here, but there's photos of the searches being done on the farm and just how large it was. And if I'm not mistaken, the Picton farm had a much larger acreage than both the Brady and the Prairie Green do. So it was at least 65 women disappeared from Vancouver's downtown east side between 1978 and 2001. But he was only charged with murdering 26 of the women. So there is estimates that there's more. And that's why I have reasons to estimate that there's more victims with this monster who murdered these four women.
right, and again, it's all women again.
Yeah, all women. All women. And Picton was also Indigenous and people of color. There was a lot of that.
So Mike asks, Cambria, do you have faith in the search committee? I didn't, thinking it was an excuse not to search committee until you said it was indigenous led.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we've had to take some really, really extreme measures because the police had their own secret feasibility study and decided that they were not going to search. And it's a long story. It's a really long story. So I went to Ottawa. I spoke in the House of Commons, which wasn't planned. And then I spoke at AFN, where they brought my speech to an emergency debate in the House of Commons. And I think it was 2 days later, I met Trudeau. And that's when I called him out to his face and said that he needed to search for these women. And sorry, what was the base question? I know I was getting somewhere.
She said he asked Cambria, do you have faith in the search committee? I didn't. I thought it was an excuse not to search committee until you said it was indigenous led.
Okay, yeah. So come calling out Trudeau, and whenever I go back to Winnipeg, and that's when it was announced that he said that he would fund looking into the search or whatever, right? And that's when we decided that based on, the fact that I had to call on Danny Smyth's resignation and he wouldn't even acknowledge my sister and I as human beings, and based on the fact that we even called upon the United Nations Special Repertoire to oversee the search because we don't trust them. So yeah, we fought really, really hard to have an Indigenous run feasibility committee, as well as ensuring that one of my family members is within that as well, because originally we were not. And we made sure that we had a spot on there as well as an appointed elder of our choice. And I'm pretty sure my chief is on it and other people as well, like within management of the landfills and such.
So this one, I know it's have you been on Democracy Now yet with this story?
Democracy Now?
Yeah.
No, what's that?
Okay.
Is that a
So yeah, Democracy Now is kind of an alternative news outlet. So they really kind of try to cover stories that mainstream media um, alters or censors and do it in more of a raw form as well.
yeah.
So, and then there's also the Young Turks and the Surfs. Now, the Surfs actually, the Surfs TV actually are one of the groups that just raided into me. Lance does this sort of very similar thing where he tells stories about things in a way that the mainstream media doesn't tell it.
Mm-hmm.
And he tries to really make people aware of the political aspects that are involved in a lot of actions. So he's suggesting that he would like to at some point touch base with you and perhaps have you come onto his stream, and maybe he'd like to do a fundraiser as well. And he's got a lot, like he's a pretty big streamer in
Mm-hmm.
comparison to my community. He's been doing this for a long time, so he's got a lot
Yeah.
more. A much larger community, so that would might be something that you could consider.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm open
but
to any.
those three outlets are alternative outlets, right? They're not mainstream where
Yeah.
they're following the censorship or the sugarcoating, or they have to worry about their funders or their
Yeah.
you
The
know
government. the
the
government's the one.
sponsorships and all the other stuff, right? So I think sometimes in that case, that's where avenues like this are actually better. Like democracy now has been around for a long time, and they're pretty big, and the Young Turks are really. Um, Actually, I think I've reached out to the Young Turks once already about this story, but I've tried to push them a little bit to try to cover this as well because they really wanted to let people know about the alternative news as well, right?
Yeah.
So that's really good. Now, did anyone else in here have questions for Cambria while we're in between her talking? Because she was going to pretend. Oh, there's another raid. Hi, Jillian Hayek. Um, Jillian is actually from uh, BC, if I remember, and she's a Métis streamer. She's a singer and songwriter, and she's becoming more and more aware of some of these issues that are going on as well. And so she just brought her community over too. So that's really great that we got more people joining us. So thank you again for everyone who's here. And again, feel free to post any questions in the chat that you might have for Cambria.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you were going to just tell us a little bit about who your mother was, right?
Yeah. So my mother Morgan, I lived with her all the way until I was 6 years old, and we lived on this house on Simcoe Street. And every weekend I would go to sleepovers at my aunt Crystal's. And one time we were on the way home, and by the time we got back to my home on Simcoe Street, my house was surrounded by police and garbage bags. So essentially, I was getting taken away by Child and Family Services, and I wasn't allowed to see my mom. And to this day, I still don't really know what happened, but she shouted to me from the door that she loved me and that she would get me and my sister back, and that we were going for a long sleepover. And that sleepover ended up lasting all the way until I was 21 years old. I actually just aged out of care in March, last March. And throughout the years, I watched my mom be preyed upon by society. And it was sad because she struggled with addiction, and even in the beginning stages of it, she lost her kids, and when you lose your kids, you lose all hope. And then she lost her home, and then she was homeless, no money, nowhere to go. And then mental illness kicks in. She didn't have the she didn't have the I guess you could say the funds, not the funds, the means to help herself. And she tried, but these shelters would just kick her out over and over again.
But you're only
Or
allowed to be in there for a certain period of time, right? I think.
Yeah, you're only allowed to be in there for a certain period of time. Some of them it's like 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And a lot of people don't like staying in shelters here, specifically in Winnipeg, because you can't bring in your shopping cart of stuff. And your shopping cart's your home. That's all your belongings. So of course you're not going to leave it. You can't go in with your partner. And your partner again, that's your home. You don't separate. You When you're on the streets, you stay with who you know. Treatment centers here, when people want to get clean, there's freaking waiting lists. And when they want to get clean, they want to get clean right then and there. And for you to tell them they got to wait, that's you telling them to go continue using, because otherwise they're going to die from withdrawal. And that's what a lot of society doesn't seem to understand. And my mom had it rough even when I was young, and she gave birth to me when she was 18, and she went on to have 4 more kids. So it's not just me, it's my sister Kira, my sister Janelle, my brother Seth, my brother Gabriel, and the youngest being 4 or 5 years old. And she got preyed on a lot. She got preyed on a lot. I remember even as a kid, my mom telling me stories of her being raped. And you shouldn't tell your kid that, but my mom was so mentally gone from by that point because of all the stuff that had happened to her. I heard and I seen some pretty horrible things. Even though I was in care, I got visits, and I used to go over to her house on Mountain Avenue, and we'd go on bus adventures when the kids were sleeping, her boyfriend was sleeping, and she'd take me up and down Main Street, going to all the bad places you shouldn't, because she was looking for friends, she was looking for something for us to do. We'd go on adventures anywhere, and I remember just specifically down Main Street, there would be creepy men asking to sniff her or offering her pills right in front of me, even asking us to follow them into the freaking bars. My mom had this boyfriend who was like 50 years old when I was 9 or 10, and she told me to keep quiet about it, and I didn't realize it until 10, 15 later, 10, 15 years later, that was a freaking John. That was a freaking pimp who was sexually trafficking my mom to other men. I remember going over to his place, and there were always 5 or 6 men around. And it's sad because she was such a beautiful person before, addiction took over, and before these systems failed her, because she did try. She was in and out of homeless shelters, and one thing I can say is she absolutely knew how to survive. She knew where her beds were, she knew where food was, she knew how to contact people, she knew where her family lived. She would always, once every couple years, she'd go pop in just to let us know that she was alive, because she's hard to find. We never knew where she was. And I would love for people to explain how this is my fault, because I'm seeing a lot of that right now, a lot of victim blaming and saying that my mom's death is my fault. And I would love for them to explain how I could have helped my mother when I was a child and care of my damn self. I was a damn child, damn kid and care of my damn self, and I was a vulnerable Indigenous youth. I was AWOLing myself. I was struggling with mental illness and suicide attempts. I was living in shelters. I lived in shelters for probably 2 years of my life. I lived in group homes, and dangerous ones at that, where you couldn't leave your room, where girls were hiding knives in the damn walls and putting posters over it so you couldn't see. And it just goes to show you how the struggle it's all around, and they failed me, they failed my mom, and they wrongly separated us. And it's messed up because in the beginning, my mom was allowed to keep 2 of the kids while my sister and I were separated. And that still happens today. I would love CFS to explain where and why that is right to break up siblings. And everything that I'm saying right now is what all led up to my mother being murdered. Freaking my family history, my great grandmother Ava Francis and her husband Donald Francis, they had to escape the reserve due to insufficient food rations provided by the federal Indian agents, where they ended up on a highway, and they were displaced because of highway construction, and they ended up in a landfill. So do you see that correlation, ending up in a landfill? And then my great grandmother Rose Harris goes on to be a residential school survivor, and her daughter Candace Harris ends up being a part of the child welfare system, as well as my mother and me. And it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning. It's intergenerational trauma linked to these systems that the government has implemented over the hundreds of years in order to take control of our people rather than helping them, because that's really what it is about. It's about saying that you have some form of control over what is going on in the world, and we know in actuality that you don't give a damn about these women, because if you gave a damn about them, you would be searching for my mom, and you would be treating me like a basic human being, and taking what I have to say too hard and actually putting it out there instead of censoring me completely over and over again, because I have a lot to say. And while I know I am not always right, I do think I am entitled to my opinion, and my mother deserves so much more. As my Aunt Dog explained it, despite my mom having a tiny little 5-foot stature, my mom had the soul of a freaking UFC fighter. And, anyone who would have looked at her the wrong way would have been sorry. Quite frankly, she had this confidence and this fire burning in her heart that everyone loved. And it sucks because this monster, she did not stand a chance. And these women did not stand a chance. And Indigenous women over and over do not stand a chance to what is happening to them, because society, greater society, and the government and everyone else lets them get away with it. Because we all people turn deaf ears, they turn a blind eye. They don't care. It's not me, it's not my problem. We need to get rid of that motto. It should be your problem. This isn't everyone's problem. This isn't everyone's problem when you see how it's being used against each other. Sorry, I rant off.
Don't absolutely. And I get that mentality. Is that it's the perception that people or the perspective people have when they say it's not my problem. Is that they really don't understand that if you allow one segment of the human population to be treated a certain way, that is ultimately going to spread out to other populations. And if
Yeah,
it doesn't affect you today, it may affect you tomorrow or the next generation. Maybe it affects your children. Um, but we got to stay away from that idea that you know I think that it doesn't affect me, so it's not my problem. That's
yeah,
just the wrong way of looking at things because we're all humans and ultimately that is going to affect all humans at some point on some level. And that's kind of just my thought anyway.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
Roller Dragon says it's definitely not your fault. What has happened to your mother, and she's just Roller Dragon is showing support. Um, Jillian said she's a Winnipegger. I guess I got her province wrong. She said, I worked in a program here in Winnipeg that helped people find housing and shelters, and those concerns were often raised. So the shelter that used to operate, Zamboni said, the shelter that used to operate in his city before it shut down attracted the worst employees. Oftentimes, security guards bragged about being able to beat the residents without any repercussions. So,
A lot happens in these shelters.
so
Just
they just essentially power tripped is what it sounds like they're doing. Abusing their position. Um,
absolutely.
and uh, Brutecci, uh, oh, Brute Brute Chief. Um, do you think it's possible for Canada, in its current form, to make amends for its history? That's a pretty tough question, because
I don't think we'll ever be able to make amends. And the reason why I say that is because this, what society and what the government has done over the hundreds of years, that's a great big store. And we can't make amends until we get rid of the systems put in place that, have stripped us of our rights, quite frankly. We won't make amends until those systems change in order to ensure that Indigenous peoples have just a higher value of life than non-Indigenous peoples. And really, all we're asking for is just basic respect and safety for not only Indigenous peoples but for all people around Canada. And we won't ever be able to make amends because we have too much too much wrong going on, like the white supremacists, the far right, the people who push these views, and the people who let them get away with those views. That in itself is contributing to lateral violence. And we need to stop the lateral violence. We need to stop the cycle of violence. We need to stop the normalization of the degradation of Indigenous peoples. We need to stop the colonialism and the systemic oppression and racism against Indigenous peoples. Like you said earlier with the statistics, with how many female youth and male youth alone are incarcerated, and how 50% of kids in care in Canada are Indigenous, and in Manitoba alone, over 80% of kids in care are Indigenous. And it's all systemic. It's everywhere. It's a million different little systems put in place over hundreds of years that we need to slowly dismantle because we know it doesn't happen overnight. But we need your help and then our help as well, the Indigenous community, to come together finally and dismantle the systems that are not only harming us, but harming you too in your society because they're turning us against each other. And I will admit that, yeah, some people just want to be against each other. Some people are just angry. You can't change them. You really can't, but you can pray and hope and that they one day open their heart and realize that what we are talking about and what's going on is a very serious issue. And it doesn't get fixed until indigenous people start getting taken seriously. You acknowledge that you're on stolen land. You give us our land back. You give us our own laws. You give us our own systems instead of your system that you implemented.
But this whole idea of I've heard, I guess, countering arguments even about the whole land acknowledgments. Um, because first of all, the people who should be doing land acknowledgments aren't the indigenous people either.
Yeah,
Although there are events where we've gone and we've seen indigenous people say, I'm on the traditional lands, blah blah blah, and I do it too. Actually, when I open my stream, I acknowledge where I'm from, and the traditional lands that I'm streaming from. But in reality, I think to a large degree that it should be non-indigenous people making the acknowledgments, first of
yeah,
all, but it also should be more than just a box that they're checking,
yeah,
because that's the whole systemic part of it, right? The corporate mentality is, if I check off the boxes that I've done this and I've done that, and I can now go through my day with a clear conscience. So
yeah,
corporations who are starting these little committees now, because there's now this big trend of having um, diversity and inclusivity committees within corporations, who are supposed to be making all the employees aware of the various cultures within the workplace.
yeah,
So, which is all great, and that's nice that they do that. However, where's the accountability in what they're doing? So, what are these committees are actually accomplishing? Are they just checking off the boxes to say, okay, we've had all the employees watch this video about, you know, black people in Canada, about indigenous people in Canada, about women in Canada. Okay, we've checked that box, we've checked that box, we've checked that box. But now what are you doing with that information? Where do you
yeah.
go from there? Is that all you do is say I've checked off the boxes and I can go through my day and feel like I belong to a ethical
So
corporation?
I'm so happy you said that because that's perfect. Because this is why we need to call out our own chief and councils too. This is exactly why we call out our own chief and councils too. Where are they when we need the support?
Right.
Because so far I've seen no one. I've seen no one besides my own chief or my reserve come forward and provide us a tent where, and I've had people all around Canada provide support, but where is our own people when we need the help? The people in power that are put there specifically to help us as Indigenous peoples, where are they? And just, it's like you said, it's, we shouldn't make it a checklist, and that's what they're doing, right? They scroll down, they go about their day, and then they forget about it, right? Whereas I'm still sitting here protesting and talking about this in present day with you. You know what I mean?
And it comes up even right up to our federal government, because
Yeah,
when you think
absolutely.
of, I mean, like I said, the liberal government that we have now have set have said their priority is reconciliation and building those alliances back with the Indigenous peoples of Canada. So, if that were the case, why was Trudeau not at the ceremony for the 215 children that were found in Kamloops when they invited him? In fact, didn't even respond to their invitation. Um, and then so he says, "I'm sorry, that was my mistake." Then comes out the news of in pictures of him doing the whole blackface thing. He comes out, "I'm sorry, um, that was my mistake." And then
Yeah.
we have the very first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, and he writes a little blurb on a paper, and they post it on his website, but doesn't go to any of the ceremonies. So if we're a priority, where is he?
He said
And
in 2014. what was happening to Indigenous women and girls was a genocide. So, yeah.
So that's what's frustrating is that we keep trying to make this progress and move forward, and it's like we step one step forward, but we're stepping two steps back. And so that progress that we're getting is just kind of slow, very slow in coming, and it's not. We're just not reaching it the way that it should. I mean, we got 100. What was it? 123 calls to action for
Oh,
the missing and murdered Indigenous women. We had the like 94 calls to action.
231 justice, yeah.
Yeah, and another 92 or 94 for the missing for the residential school children. Of those 94 actions, he's done like 10 in the last since 2015 when he was first given that report.
It's perfect you said that. Here, I have something really good. So this is from NWAC. So 2 years after, this was June 3rd, 2022. 2 years after the national inquiry into MMIWG 2S was made public, the federal government announced a budget of $2.2 billion over 6 years to look into the genocide of MMIWG, and little action has been made over the course of 12 months, even though they quite literally gave Trudeau a 7 plan layout, and that was to achieve transformative changes in attitudes, behaviors, and knowledge within broader society, and to keep families and survivors at the center of the process for ending the violence and provide them with concrete support, none of which they have done. Support the delivery of programs and services by Indigenous organizations, including at the grassroots level, such as warriors or anyone else doing the work, right? Develop a national Indigenous human rights accountability mechanism that includes treaty and constitutional rights. Support a paradigm shift in policies and systems across Canada, which defines transformative change in justice, health, wellness, human security, culture, and Indigenous human rights. And establish a culturally appropriate Indigenous data infrastructure reflective of Indigenous women based on Indigenous data sovereignty and immediate next steps. So they gave him all the steps and he announced the money, but he's doing absolutely nothing with it. And Statistics Canada comes out with these stats over and over again, and nothing changes to stop it. And the only thing that changes it is the rising statistics and rising numbers when we're not statistics. And I'm sick of us being treated like that when we're so much more than that.
Well, yeah, and like Lux Ellis is just saying, you know, Trudeau said that he was going to have um, all the drinking water advisories taken from the all the indigenous communities done
Mm-hmm.
and resolved by 2021. We're now into 2023, and there are still something like 33 indigenous communities um, with under drinking long-term drinking advisories.
Something is
Um,
basic.
so this is a long time of that he's passed where he said he was going to meet. So he's not meeting his own promises, which is um, part of what's going to happen is that's going to speed up as soon as we get closer to election time. When
Mm-hmm.
election time comes, suddenly there's going to
No one.
be a lot more money
Yeah,
moving a lot faster for the things they're going to be addressing issues to the people who are going to get his votes.
that's why
So,
we keep.
so I think that we have a kind of a mixed attitude amongst even the indigenous people when it comes to voting for the federal government or even the provincial government for that matter, is that this is not our systems. These are colonial systems. These are colonizer systems that have been set up to take control of the land and the water and the resources. So why should we vote in that system? So there's the naysayers who feel if you vote for any politician, it's not going to make a difference because ultimately they are all going to end up doing the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
The counter to that are the voters who say, well, if you don't vote, then what happens when people like, say, the Conservative Party get into power, um, who are definitely very more right wing and Eurocentric minded than, say, the Liberals or the NDP? Well, the NDP people don't vote for in the federal elections because they've never gotten power. No one feels they'll ever get power, so they just don't vote for them. So the only counter to the Conservatives are the Liberals, which who have done some stuff for us, but it's still so
It's so
snail
many.
pace getting it done. And it should be there's got to be a way of lighting a fire under their carcasses to kind of um, get that motion going on. So someone said, Gaming Body Museum said, where I'm from in British Columbia, people are saying reconciliation is dead. So it's kind of like they don't believe
That it's ever gonna
that
happen.
it's ever going to happen.
Yeah.
So there's
Reasonable. We have reasons to believe, right?
right. So I guess to that argument, someone might say, well, you got the glass half empty then, versus the people who might look at it a little bit differently and think there's got to be hope for the future because once you stop hoping, then you stop the movement.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's got to be balance, and that's what I've always been taught by my elders is everything in life that we have, there's always a balance. There's always going to be the naysayers and the go-getters, I guess, so to
Yeah.
speak. There's always going to be the bad and the good. There's always, there's always that balance. There's always both two sides to every coin. All that other cliche
Yeah.
terms.
It's
Um,
true.
so it's just a matter of which which side of the coin is landing up, and as to where we're going to move forward or not. So game Kraken Hugger said, I was reading a book and it was saying that indigenous and black women are the testing grounds for violence before it moves on to white women. What do you think of that comment?
That's a very interesting way to look on it. But I will say that specifically in Winnipeg, I can't say I've seen a lot of white men specifically preying on Indigenous women more so than being with white women and people of their own race. And that's because they know that Indigenous women are more vulnerable. And they take advantage of that because we as Indigenous women, we don't know how to watch out for the warning signs of being preyed upon because people have been letting people prey upon us for years and no one teaches us, right? But that is a very, very interesting take on it.
We get
Whether
taught, we do get taught. The question is, are we taught the right things?
that's true.
So when we think of over the last, say, 150 years of residential schools, I mean, the last residential school didn't close in Canada until like 1997. So if you think of how many generations of our people that is, all of them being taught from children that our culture is bad, our ceremonies and our traditions are dirty and evil and all the you get told that from the day that you're into a school till the time you're an adult for generation after generation. At some point, you start to believe that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have got that many years of intergenerational effects to overcome. And
Absolutely.
it's, if it's taken us 150 years to get to this part in where we are in our
Mm-hmm.
self-esteem and our expectations in society, then it's going to probably take us another 150 years to get back to where we were at the beginning.
Yeah,
Um,
and that makes me scared for the future generations
but
because they're the ones who have to fight up what we're doing right now, right?
Well, and that's why it's important that we're doing this stuff now, right?
Yeah.
So you being out there and bringing this awareness to people is the only way for the masses to understand that there's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we rely on mainstream media to tell the history and the experiences of what it's like to be in Canada, people are going to continue to have that picture that Canada's reputation has had around the world for since it came here, is that we are such a great multicultural welcoming country who treats everyone so nicely, when the reality of it is that they're not. It's like going to a country and just getting to the resorts but never going into the back streets and seeing how the real people live. If all you do is go to the resorts and you see the nice clean beach with the white sand,
I want to
you're going to
see, right?
think that's a beautiful country. But you got to take that time to go to the back streets and see what the real people live like, and talk to the real people. And that's what Canada needs, is for people to be able to see what's actually on the ground level, where it's not all just the people who have been privileged live, because the privileged people who have the the nice cars and the nice houses and the all the other stuff, that's not really Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. And the cat, like you said, when we think of Canada, we think of freedom and moose and happy things. But the real Canada is we let white supremacists get away with murdering vulnerable Indigenous women over and over again, and nobody blinks an eye. That's the Canada that we're dealing with essentially, and it's genocide. No one wants to admit that, but it is. It is an Indigenous genocide, and Indigenous women in Canada are not safe, and Indigenous people in general are not safe. And we see it over and over again because we're always in the highest amongst the numbers in terms of homicide rates.
So Laxala says, I don't think any political leader has anything but self-serving, or are anything but self-serving, to be honest. And I think that there are people who get into politics who have a ideology that they can make a positive change. But then when they get into office, they start to see the uphill battle that they have to face to try to get those things accomplished that they initially thought were great, that they were going to do these great changes, and so they end up failing, um, in a big way in some cases, because they just, they don't have the fight in them to kind of do what us people on the on the grassroots movements do. They don't have that hunger, because again, most of the people who are getting into politics, and I may be stereotyping, are probably a lot of privileged people, people who've had fairly good
But
backgrounds and families, and you know um,
not real experiences.
yeah,
I
they've
should
never
say.
had to been in a lot of cases. I won't say all. I mean, we look at the Alexandria Cortez in New York. I mean, she's comes from a very poor background, and was a waitress, and fought her way to become where she is at. But I mean, those are the few and far in between. And so we are now starting to see some indigenous women um, get into politics, who are really trying to push for change, and that's a good thing to see. Um, Even if it is part of the colonial system,
Yeah.
it's one of those things. If you can't beat them, join them. And then once you
Yeah.
get in there, then you can make your movements from inside versus trying to fight it all the time from outside. Because sometimes it's like we feel like we're banging our heads against the wall to try to get things accomplished.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
So thanks for that comment, Lexalis. If someone allows one person to be subjected to that type of treatment, it speaks volumes on who they are and the type of society that they live in. I know that what you said, I'm just agreeing. Okay, thank you, Pines. Um, it does say something about our society, right? I mean, and that's the whole, that was kind of the whole point is what I was trying to say about Canada is that, people have a perception of it, but um, they're not seeing how the indigenous people here are being treated. And so that perception is a little through rose-colored glasses.
Pretty much.
And SFX Pines just want to say, let Cambria know that I'm listening and hanging on to every word. So, so more support. That's great.
I think we
Prime,
covered everything.
what's that?
I think we covered everything. My mind's like foggy now.
Right. Uh, it says DJ B North. APTN is covering this story as well, I hope. Yes, in fact, actually, Cambria has been on APTN News. DJ
I'm gonna be on Swedish radio soon.
on the Swedish radio.
Yeah.
That's
And
awesome.
yeah, Swedish radio. Apparently, I made it.
Spy check said, damn, I remember a white man looking for his lost Bitcoin in a landfill and got all kinds of media attention and support.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, and they
well,
were trying to look for it. I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure they did try looking for it because he had like $1.3 billion or something worth of Bitcoin on his little terabyte stick, and never found it. But yeah, just makes you wonder. And there was a landfill search in somewhere in Ontario, and it was a white man. And it was a much larger landfill than what the Brady and Prairie Green are, and they tore that landfill up in a mere matter of hours to look for him. And they've known these women to be there since June.
right. So with this one, critical conversations like this will always have those who seek to break up sad conversation. As long as there are those here to listen and support, we can keep it on track. I don't know, it makes it sound to me like violence against indigenous women is about white women. It feels kind of gross. I'm not sure what that means, Faustian. Um, I hear you. I don't perceive it as nihilistic. I see it as we can't expect Canada to do the right thing. I believe the implication is system change, not system reform. Um, yeah, I mean, ultimately breaking
There's some
that whole thing down and kind of building back up from the ground in a way that treats everyone equally. Um, I don't know how. Um, I'm not sure how realistic it is. Um, but I mean, ultimately, that would be, that would be the route to go if it were possible. So yeah, that's how I interpret reconciliation is dead, and to me, it is optimistic. It just acknowledges that Canada won't ever make things right because it is inherently exploitive. Um, yeah, I guess that's kind of like opportunist ideologies, right? Is that it's almost intuitive for humans to be greedy and self-preserving, and so as such, we really are kind of narrow-minded in that sense that we want to do things that are bring us instant gratification versus the long term, which I think is when you think back to our teachings as I was young, was always thinking 7 generations ahead. We don't think about instant gratification. We're not thinking about today. We're thinking about what we can do today for tomorrow, for the next 7 generations, because we got to make this planet somewhere that's inhabitable for our grandchildren and great grandchildren and their children. So yeah, I get that. It's always going to be. Well, I shouldn't say it's always going to be exploitive, but um, I think human nature makes us exploitive of what's around us. but that can change, and I guess that's going to come down to hope again, and having some faith in educating and bringing some awareness out to people that will have them see things in a different light, and hopefully create that change in attitude about having that needed for instant gratification. So there are people who do not want anything to change. It is to happen in the schools, which are more important than any prime minister, etc. It has to
Yes,
happen. Oh, it has to happen in the schools, which are
Indigenous.
more important than any prime minister, etc. Yeah, I
What a lot
agree
of
with
people
that.
realize is indigenous people specifically have very different political views than non-indigenous peoples, and the quote unquote white man fails to see that side, even though we've had our own laws and stuff in place much longer before you ever pulled these laws of yours into place to take over us as indigenous peoples. And it's very, very interesting concept, definitely.
And so the ideas with the schools is not a new thought. I mean, if you think of Buffy St. Marie, for example, who's been an activist since 1960s, um, has started the Cradle Board project, which
This
is an idea to try to educate both indigenous and non-indigenous people of true history of these lands at a young age in a way that's positive and nurturing, because if you can do it at that age when they're in, you know, kindergarten and grade one, two, three, four, then by the time they become adults, they've learned that we all have to work together and things can be different. So yes, it is definitely more important in the schools than any prime minister will ever be, because the people the prime minister is preaching to are going to be his fans. you know, which are people that are not going to be around as long.
and
It
everything is
would
result of from what you were taught.
So it may not be, but like Cambria said, there aren't many safe places for Native women. They are vulnerable, from whom is irrelevant. So it doesn't matter who is killing the indigenous women. That part of it's not so important. I mean, that's what I'm reading. Although, you know, when you think about the violence against indigenous women, it is not just white people that are abusing our women either. I mean, we are abusing our own women. And the Native Ontario Native Women's Association just did an event last November on violence against women. And Indigenous women specifically. And they do this once a year, and they put on a poetry night, and people will write poetry and send their poems in. And I had sent in a kind of a prose about that whole idea, is that we got to stop this idea that it's of accepting that that's okay, because if we don't break the colonial mentality's idea that that it's okay, or normalizing the abuse against our indigenous women within our communities, then how are we going to expect the people outside of our communities to treat our women any better? So we do have to kind of look at ourselves as well. Um, to a large degree, our indigenous men have to learn how to treat and respect our indigenous women. um, that has to happen as well. Um, because if we say it's okay for Native men to beat on their wives or their daughters or whoever, that's just going to continue to normalize it, because we're teaching our children that that's okay then. And our children are going to grow up expecting, oh, well, that's the norm. And then so when they see it happen outside of our communities, they're not going to blink, because that's the norm. And that's kind of where that intergenerational thing comes back into play, right? If we still continue to teach, that's what we're teaching, and that's going to continue for the next 7 generations.
And
So
so that leaves me with a question myself, is because I've been really wanting to bring up this topic specifically for the last couple of weeks now, but the media won't put it out there. But what causes a need for, our men to hurt our own woman? And like we said, it comes down to intergenerational trauma and systemic oppression of, you tell us enough times that we're woman beaters, we're welfare bombs, we're this and that, we're gonna start believing it, we're gonna start taking those things to heart. You tell us we're addicts. Well, no wonder why we're addicts. It's because nobody helps us. You repeatedly tell us that and then pick us to the side on top of it. And
And the resources to counter that aren't being provided.
yeah, and
So
our youth are hurting too. Our
so
youth.
so the funding for organizations that help with cancer or help with uh, lung diseases, all these other causes, there's always tons of money to go into these things. Yet when it comes to how do we defeat homelessness? I mean, just homelessness in general, not even just indigenous homelessness, but in homelessness has to stop because if we don't have the people in the streets who are helpless or feel helpless and their esteem is going down, that affects everybody as well.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of, you know, feeds into that system. And I think the other problem that we have in Canada with stereotypes, or the racism comes from stereotypes, is that when people are driving down the street, the people the indigenous people they see in the streets aren't the indigenous people who are at work making a living and taking care of their family. They're seeing the homeless people. They're seeing the drug addicts. They're seeing the drinkers. And if that's all they ever see of indigenous people, then
What they think.
that's what they think indigenous people are. And so that picture has to change. And part of that is setting up those resources and putting the funding out there to get our indigenous people off of the streets, get them off of the drinking and the alcohol or the drugs, whatever they happen to to be their demon, so that they can actually stand on their own 2 feet and take some pride in what in their lives. Because if they're given a chance, indigenous people want to be as work and have families and do all the other stuff that non-indigenous people do, right? We all have those same aspirations. We all want to have nice comfortable lives and homes and families. I mean, that just goes without saying. But if we don't have the resources to help us get to that point, then then we're kind of battling that uphill battle that's hard to win. And then that in turn pushes the non-indigenous people to think, oh, while they're still bums, they're still drunks, they're still drug addicts, they're still, this and that. So it's kind of this cycle, that little circle that's hard to, we're chasing our own tail.
Violence.
Yeah. And then that hopelessness turns into to our men thinking it's, they get frustrated, they get angry. And what do people do when they get frustrated and angry? They lash out. And who do we lash out at? We lash out at the ones that we love. So our wives and our children. And so that domestic violence is what becomes the norm. And that's what we teach our children is the norm. And that's where that cycle just continues. Um, so there has to be some resources put out there for stopping that cycle.
Okay, I think I can answer one more question and then I gotta go.
Okay. Let's see. Anyone else got questions here? Yeah, it says I used to be.
My class.
Cambria, thank you for your courage and strength to be able to speak in such a composed manner that really drives home the importance of what you are talking about. I'm sorry I'm not. Oh, great job, Cambria. You did a great job sharing with everyone what everyone needs to hear. Um, Thank you for sharing your story, Cambria. I hope you're doing well as you can given the circumstances you're in. So I tend to stay away from. For me, it's semantics. I stay away from the term stories because what we share oftentimes is not a story. It's our experiences. It's our lives. It's our history. And I understand the mindset that makes us trigger always using the term stories, because that's what we get fed all the time when we listen to the media. Well, let us tell you about the next story. Here's our next story. You know, an indigenous woman found dead in a garage. Here's our next story. Etc. We always hear that term, and I think that we got to kind of cut that or nip that a little bit in thinking if we change the terminology, then we can change the way that we see things. And if we change the way we see things, then we can change the attitude that we have about those things. Um, so again, it just snowballs. So yeah, gotta go, Cambria. Good chat. Makes sense to me. It doesn't matter who's doing the harm. What matters is that the harm is being allowed to be done.
Mhm. Yep.
So there's a lot of agreement in what you're saying, and people understand that. Um, so I'll send you a link to Lance. Lance is uh, he's the voice of the Serfs TV, and he's a political speaker who talks about everything politics, and movements like this. So this is kind of right up his alley as well. And he, I think, was trying to reach out. He didn't know how to get in contact with you.
Okay.
So I will send you his information so he can reach out to you as well. And I appreciate you again, Cambria. Anytime. Now, that being said, you'd asked me earlier about, do I have to create a Twitch account in order to do this?
Mhm.
And you don't necessarily have to create a Twitch account. That being said, if you do create a Twitch account, which is free, anybody can do it. It will give you a platform that you can use to share as well. So
Yeah.
you could essentially have other guests come over. I'm not sure how many other people at the camp would like to talk, but I'm sure that there are probably people at the camp who'd like to talk. I know I can't remember her name now.
May I see Melissa?
Nope, not Melissa. She's not indigenous.
Hmm.
She's not actually indigenous. So she said she wasn't indigenous, but she's been on the news. She's been on the news in a couple of different clips I've seen. Um, I'd know her name to think of it. Anyway, she seemed like she would be someone, a great ally. She's been there from day one.
What's
Um,
talking about?
yeah, I can't remember her name. It'll come to me when I'm not trying to think about it. But
Thank you for having me on though. And
we'll
like,
be keeping in touch anyway.
yeah, yeah, no, for sure.
And
Thank you.
Fantastic Kitty said thank you too. So everyone's appreciative that you came and were able to share and ask, answer questions. So thank you again so much, and we'll keep in touch. We'll keep updating the community, and maybe we'll have you back when we start to see some movement actually
Yeah,
happen.
there's stuff is always happening here at Camp Morgan, and we plan to have it set up until the search is done, which could be until the end of spring, right? And so we got to do other things in the meantime to keep the awareness going.
Yeah, and again, there's a link there, chat, if you wanted to follow the Facebook group and get updates from there as well. Um, and a link or an email if anyone has the ability to make any donations to the camp. They are always in need of uh, firewood, medicines for the sacred fire, any food. Anything that you give will go directly to helping the people at the camp. And there's a little boo boo.
There's my baby. This is Willow, like the tree. She's 2.5. She wanted to come
Willow.
say hi.
Nice.
She wants to come say hi before we say goodnight. Say goodnight.
Thanks
Hey,
again. We'll talk to you again soon, Cambria.
have a good night. Thank you for having me on. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Willow like the tree. So, Yonko, again, for everyone who's been here, let me just change this around. I'm going to close that out. Close that. So I was, she talked longer than I thought she would. She hung out a little longer than I thought she would. So, but that's great. Awesome. Now, here's a couple of things that's coming up. For anyone in the U.S., there is a documentary coming out at the Sundance Film Festival. It's a three-part documentary that's being premiered called Murder at Bighorn. And Murder at Bighorn is a documentary based on the missing and murdered Indigenous women issue in the U.S. And so if you go to the Sundance Festival website, um, you'll see the dates where it'll screen. So this is basically a brand new documentary that's premiering this month at the Sundance Film Festival. So you can go there, and you can I guess you can get tickets just to watch that particular video. Now, at this point, it's not available to people outside of the U.S. as far as I know, um, just because of licensing. Um, the bureaucracy that goes along with licensing. Um, but it does look like a good documentary. And here's, I guess, another talk about things that kind of give you a sign of the society you live in, is that there are right now a number of documentaries um, about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And particularly on the National Film Board of Canada's website. If you check out that, it's just www.nationalfilmboard.ca. I think that's it. If I click on that, did that come up right? And Lance, I got your whisper. So I appreciate the link. I will definitely um, pass that on to Cambria so that she can get in touch with you, and you guys can uh, discuss her coming out. Yeah, so that's the link to the National Film Board of Canada, and they have I think 5 different documentaries on there about missing and murdered Indigenous women. So there is one that I have. Um, we have been asked to post a camp link. Oh, if you just put in command Camp Morgan, there's the link. Um, Joseph is the guy who's been again a big part of the organizing of the camp. And so, if you wanted to know how many people are at the camp or what the camp is doing at any given time, you can reach out to Joseph. Um, Click on the link. You can follow their Facebook group, um, and then there's his email if anybody wants to do an e-transfer of anything for them. That's there as well. So there is one documentary I thought maybe I would share with you. But before I get there, I'll get back to what I was addressing before um, before Cambria arrived. We were talking about the systemic racism that happens in Canada and why we don't see it. So I have a short clip about what systemic racism looks like in Canada. I'll play that. It's only like what is it? 10 minutes long. So just to kind of give you a background, like I was saying, of what got us to this point, as far as the status or the social climate with Indigenous people here in Canada. So let me get my face off the screen here, and I will share this here.
This is sovereign Wet'suwet'en land. You are trespassing.
Canada has been really good at convincing itself and the world that the terrible things that come out of colonization somehow didn't happen here.
There's no systemic discrimination. There's no system in Quebec.
Thank God that we're different than the United States.
Their denial is part of the system of systemic racism.
It's an inaccurate history.
This country was founded on systemic discrimination.
We don't talk about the origins, where it comes from, how our whole society is based on white male superiority.
Systemic racism is the normalizing of racism.
It's not directly in your face.
Systemic racism is something that touches every corner of our country, every corner of our institutions.
Commissioner Brenda Lucki said she struggled with the term systemic racism. Later, the commissioner said it does exist in the RCMP.
We definitely have that in the RCMP, and we are not immune to it at all.
These are institutions that were built with the intention and the understanding that they were not really to service people who are not white. There are these myths that we are so radically different from the US. Both countries are founded out of stolen and colonized land. Both countries have attempted genocide on indigenous peoples. Both countries have long histories of slavery.
It's easy to point somewhere else, and it's another form of gaslighting.
In Canada, we talk a lot about, the Underground Railroad, Black people escaping slavery and coming to Canada. But we don't also talk about how after the end of the Civil War in the US, that many of those same Black people went back to the US. And why did they go back? Because on the other side of the border, things were just as bad.
The police target and brutalize and kill Black and Indigenous people. We're literally paying for police officers to brutalize and kill us at disproportionate rate.
One of the officers shot him dead.
Moore was shot and killed by a police officer.
I don't understand how someone dies during a wellness check.
The family says the 29-year-old was alone in the unit with officers when she plunged to her death.
Inexplicably killed Rodney Levi, shot by RCMP.
The ones we see in the media now are just the most recent ones. We've had hundreds and hundreds of cases of brutality and violence, sexualized violence, killings that have never been addressed.
Let's look at the ways this structure has historically been used.
People who were enslaved would run away because they were property, not only labor, they were labor and property. Their masters, the owners would want them back, and they would hire people to go catch them. And police forces emerged out of that.
The whole purpose of the RCMP on the prairies specifically, but across Canada generally, was really to suppress Indigenous dissent.
They were also used to take children, put them into residential schools, not follow up on complaints of the sexual abuse that was going on there.
Black and Indigenous people make up nearly 40% of our federal prison population, while comprising less than 10% of the general population.
So much of the interpersonal stuff that happens between people that policing is now involved in can be better handled in communities when communities are given and have the resources to deal with interpersonal conflict.
A CBC News investigation 2 years ago found nearly half of Canadians who died in encounters with police since the year 2000 were mentally distressed.
We are here to ask for the defunding of the police.
Over the past decade, police budgets have ballooned. You see an increasing militarization of the police for a purpose that we don't understand.
So we need to spend money on mental health workers and a healthcare response, not on sending the RCMP to respond to a wellness check.
What defunding is asking us to do is to come back to the table, examine our structures as they are, and ask, is this appropriate for policing? It's about how do we get society to function as a whole better.
When you're looking at the way that cannabis rolled out in Canada, it wasn't Black or Indigenous folks that were benefiting from this system, even though we were disproportionately charged with those kinds of offenses.
This system is created to produce advantage for people who are marked as white.
You see all these long lineups of university students, of all of these people who now can go buy it recreationally, pretty much like they did before. I mean, you're talking about a very low arrest and conviction rate for white people compared to Black and Indigenous.
When it transforms into the realm of the legal, it's okay, the representation of it becomes white and white people.
And then no real substantive justice for all of those with criminal records for weed possession, and some still in prison today with weed charges. And where is the justice in that?
And that is what we mean when we say that institutional racism is a part and parcel of all the institutions, governing and non-governing, of Canadian life. We've come to a moment in our culture where to call someone racist is seen as more offensive than the person's racism.
When we call it out, we get told that it doesn't exist. We get told that we're being radical.
Jagmeet Singh, the first federal party leader of color, called a Bloc Québécois MP a racist, and when he wouldn't apologize, was ordered to leave the chamber.
It started with a motion on systemic racism in the National Police Force.
Je l'appelais un raciste et je le crois.
Singh says it wasn't just a Bloc member's decision to oppose his motion on systemic racism that angered him, but a gesture that accompanied it.
I looked back and I saw that MP not only say no, but make eye contact with me and just kind of brush his hand, dismiss it. And in that moment, I got angry.
What Jagmeet Singh was saying to this person, you are actively engaging in upholding racist systems. Thereby, by definition, you become racist.
Mr. Singh did the right thing in analyzing the gesture, naming it for what it is, and naming the minister for his behavior.
Then the media focused all attention on Jagmeet, who was kicked out of the house for refusing to apologize. Where is the focus on the person who enacted the violence?
The Bloc's leader today said Singh owes MP Alain Terrien an apology.
Me or our team, our MPs, are anything but racist people.
So Mr. Singh became the problem, not the minister with his dismissive gesture.
If our own leaders can't call it out and name it and hold people to account in Parliament, what does that say for our ability to hold
with a party of 94. Holy shit!